Good afternoon. I'm Patsy Sweeney from NERCA. Welcome to the NERCA webinar on the opioid epidemic being presented by Trent Cotney. He is the CEO of Cotney Construction Law. If you have questions, please type them into the box and Trent will answer them, or I can forward them to him. Everyone will be muted during the webinar. I'll now turn it over to Trent and go ahead. Thanks, Trent.
Sure, thank you. First and foremost, it's always a pleasure to be able to speak at NERCA. I've enjoyed being able to speak in the past, and this is a topic that has affected me personally. So obviously, my role was as legal counsel representing roofing contractors and the industry. I get asked a lot of questions. I got to deal with a lot of different issues, but I always try to mix in the real world with the legal, and I'm going to try to do that a little bit today. When I set out to kind of talk about the problem in general, what I wanted to do was come up with some ways that we as employers can figure out ways to combat the issue, after the seminar. The goal is to give you some real world advice so that we can work collectively to try to figure it out. I've always been a big believer that the roofing industry in general, that we have to help ourselves. Obviously government is out there and there's restrictions and there's things that are in place, whether it be OSHA or wage and hour or all these other things, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, I think it's up to us as an industry to take that first step and to proactively do whatever we can to reduce the problem. The problem in general with opioids is that it started off innocent enough. Opioids have been around for a long time, and they've been prescribed for a long time. But over time, money kind of took hold. And what happened is you start seeing incentive-based plans put in place for service providers and doctors to start prescribing opioids. You don't get warnings. You don't get any of the kind of things that you see on a lot of different medications now. And it got to the point where people were taking opioids, really weren't certain what they were taking, and then get hooked on the substances. I'll give you one of my personal stories after we go through this slide. So what's interesting is, there's a generic name, there's a brand name, and there's a street name. And I created this chart to kind of give you an idea of some of the different issues that you might face out there in the field. So we're all familiar with morphine. It's been used for years and years and years, but oftentimes you may be prescribed, or one of your employees may be prescribed a brand name that is not familiar, Roxanol, Oromorph. I don't know what those are. Had I not prepared for this, I wouldn't have known that they were a brand of morphine. And it's important to kind of familiarize yourself with some of the street names, because a lot of times they are used by crew. And if you're just listening casually, you might hear something and then recognize there might be an issue. Oxycodone was obviously one of the biggest ones. It's the one that we're probably familiar with the most, because the brand name OxyContin is the one that's gotten the most publicity. Okay, OxyContin kind of, is the substance, the brand name oxycodone, that brought opioids to light and sort of created, in my opinion, helped create the epidemic. There are variations of oxycodone. There's oxycodone with acetaminophen. Acetaminophen is the primary drug in Tylenol. Common names on that is Percocet. Most of us have heard that. Other variations of that are Tylox and Indocet, and you can see how easy it is to get confused as to what you're taking. Hydrocodone with acetaminophen is also a very popular opioid. Vicodin is the one that we're probably most familiar with. And keep in mind, we live in a little bit of a different world now, where for a while there, especially over the summer, you couldn't turn on the news without hearing about the lawsuits, about hearing about what attorney generals were doing in different states to help combat opioids. But go back 15, 20 years, nothing was being done. The stuff was being prescribed like it was candy. Hydromorphone, Hydrostat is the common brand name on that. And then fentanyl is the one that's scary. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time going over fentanyl and some of the issues that I've seen with that in the roofing industry. Now, the common brand name, how it's normally distributed through prescription, is a Durgesic patch, where it has timed release. It is an incredibly potent, incredibly dangerous drug, and I'll give you some illustrations to show you how. Let me give you a personal story on opioids. I think it was about 2007, 2008. I'd gone in the dentist, never a big fan of the dentist, like most people. I went in and I had a jaw tooth that was giving me some problems, okay? Ultimately, the dentist made the recommendation that I should get this tooth removed. And we had it removed, but realized that a portion of it was fused to my jawbone. So he sent me on to an oral surgeon. Got to the oral surgeon, and he started to drill and do all the things that oral surgeons do. And all of a sudden, he hit something, and I have never experienced pain like that in my life. Okay, what he did is he drilled into the nerve, and it was excruciating pain. I went home and I was on some initial painkillers to get through the surgery. And I remember sitting on my couch. My wife, who goes with me on the road a bunch, especially to a lot of the industry events, basically keeps me together. She takes a look at me, and I've got tears streaming down my face. And I like to think I'm a tough guy. I can handle some pain, but this pain was absolutely excruciating. I had never experienced anything like it. And the oral surgeon had prescribed oxycodone. Actually, it was Oxycontin was the brand name, but I had an entire prescription bottle full of the stuff. And I knew enough at the time that it was dangerous. Okay, most of us had some idea that this stuff isn't, got to treat it lightly. But it got to the point where I just couldn't take it anymore, and I took one. Okay, so I took one, and for those of you that have not experienced what it's like to be on an opioid, the best way that I can describe it, I'm sitting at a conference room table right now, okay, and I'm at one end of the conference table. At one end is your brain, and at the other end is your body. Okay, your body probably isn't doing right, but you don't feel any of it. It's a very unusual experience. I hated it, and I'm a control freak to begin with. So what I did is, as soon as I got off that stuff, I flushed the rest down the toilet, and figured I'd just soldier through it. And through Tylenol, Advil, Aleve, whatever I could get my hands on over the counter, I got through it. But what is interesting to me is we've got our crew. I guarantee you there are crew members right now that you guys have employed that are up on roofs that are self-medicating, and they're using these substances. And I can't imagine being in the condition that I was in, up on a roof, driving a truck, operating equipment. I can't see how you can do that. And that's what scares me is, there's the prescription element to it, but this stuff is so easy to get your hands on because it's overprescribed. There are you've seen the news, the doctors are notorious for giving this stuff out. Let's talk a little bit about the effects of opioids. And short term, I kind of mentioned some of the effects that I had, but drowsiness, lethargy, paranoia, nausea, pinpoint pupils. That's one that, being in the roofing industry for a while now, you can usually identify when someone is impaired. Okay, and you get a sense when somebody's on pills or if they're on something else. You kind of have that spider sense that goes off that says, okay, something's going on. Pinpoint pupils were always sort of a telltale sign. That, along with sort of slurred speech, a little bit slower movement, not as responsive as need to be. What's interesting about opioids, though, is the long term. That's what's scary, is the long-term effects of opioid use. So obviously there's nausea and vomiting, all kind of GI-related issues. You can cause some serious liver damage. Okay, a lot of people don't realize the effect that it has on liver damage, especially when you combine oxy with acetaminophen. Acetaminophen has some negative effects on liver to begin with. Brain damage can be caused, and what it does is it helps block some of the receptors that govern breathing. So a lot of people die from opioid overdose primarily because their breathing slows to the point where they're not getting sufficient oxygen to the brain. What else is interesting is you develop a tolerance, and there's a condition that can come out of prolonged opioid use that actually makes you more susceptible to pain, which is crazy. Think about that. You've got the drug that is designed to help eliminate pain actually causing you to be less pain tolerant. So these are the short-term and long-term effects. And as with everything, people are still, as the years go on and more studies are done, I guarantee you that they're going to show even more long-term effects that are going to happen. Where all this comes into play and kind of what we're seeing now is a switch from OxyContin being sort of the prevalent opioid to fentanyl. And many of you probably saw the news story a while back where there were 8 people that died in a house from an opioid overdose. It was from fentanyl. And I put a little graphic here. There's a penny, and you can see those few specks of fentanyl. That amount that you see right there on your screen is lethal. Okay, think about that. That little bit is lethal to you. Okay, what's important to know about fentanyl is it's not a naturally occurring substance. Okay, it was created in a lab. It's a synthetic opioid. And it's often mixed or cut with other drugs to increase potency. So heroin, meth, cocaine, all these other things, even marijuana, there's been some instances of that. The issue is that the people that are cutting this or providing fentanyl illegally, they're not chemists. These are not FDA regulated employees. They are people in the back of a warehouse somewhere cutting the stuff, and they have no idea how much they should put in or what they should put in. This causes a lot of the accidental overdoses. I'm going to give you a variety of stats to kind of help some of the points I'm making, but this is one that I saw that kind of stood out. Keep in mind, this a couple of years ago, but a couple of years ago, there was as many as 28,000 overdose deaths that were solely attributable to fentanyl. Okay, the reason fentanyl is so dangerous is because it does not take a lot. It doesn't take a lot at all to have that high effect that you're looking for. So it is incredibly easy to smuggle the stuff. Okay, I go everywhere with a bottle of Pepsid, a bottle of heartburn medication. It's over-the-counter stuff, but I look at those pills. They're white. That's how they transfer the stuff. Okay, they make it into pill form. They mark it as acid relief pills or Tylenol, whatever it might be, and it's almost impossible to find. You could easily carry tens of thousands of dollars worth of fentanyl in a very small bottle on a plane, and nobody's going to know it. The thing that's interesting about it is it's 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, and that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy when you think about that. I put some other stats in here about how the usage has increased dramatically, and the reason the usage has increased is because it's relatively inexpensive to make, considering how much bang for the buck you get for such a small amount. So if you are creating this drug, you stand to gain a significant amount of money, and it's in your best interest to push it out. And that's what's happening. It's easy to get your hands on. It's easy to get across state lines or across country lines. And that is why you're seeing such a big uptick in a lot of this. The graph on the top right, the synthetic opioid deaths, that also shows you the amount, that's from 2012 to 2015, the increase that you see there. And it's only going to continue. So let's turn and talk about opioids in construction. And the construction industry is definitely susceptible to opioid abuse. And part of the problem, I think, is just the chronic injuries that you have being in construction. It's not the one-time traumatic injuries like blowing out a knee or, hurting your shoulder permanently or something like that. It tends to be musculoskeletal, just normal back pains. I don't know a roofer alive that doesn't have bad knees and lower back pain. Okay, I did my story, for those of you that don't know, is my grandfather was a roofer. I worked on a demo and drywall crew to help put my way through school in Nashville and Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and I still have some shoulder pain from the time that I worked on that crew. That has followed me, from the time I was 20 till now. So I can imagine that if you are on a crew and you've been doing it any amount of time, it doesn't matter what safety protocols you have in place, you're going to have some injuries. It's just it comes part and parcel with the industry. So the injury rate in general is 77% higher than other industries. Why? It's a dangerous industry. It's if you're on a roof, if you're on scaffolding, if you're in a lift, if you're doing any of the kind of stuff that involves construction, it's inherently dangerous. What's interesting is it's also the second most vulnerable industry. Apparently the food industry is number one. Construction workers represented roughly 25% of all fatal opioid doses. Massachusetts workers from 2011 to 2015. Okay, 25%, a quarter of them, opioid overdoses. And it doesn't matter where I go in the U.S. When I ask an audience, and I know you guys can't communicate freely with me, but if I asked you what is the biggest problem that roofing faces right now, okay, the answer is going to be lack of skilled labor. Okay, it doesn't matter where I go. I can be in California, I can be in Texas, I can be in Florida, I can be, in Massachusetts, Maine, wherever. The answer is always the same. I can find plenty of people that don't know what they're doing. I can't find anyone that actually knows how to put on a roof. So if you think about it, one of the things that we as an industry have tried hard to do is figure out how to help eliminate some of that demand and create more supply. How do we get more workers into the workforce? And there's been a variety of things that have been done. Okay, you think about things like, increased vocational training so that, people come out of high school and instead of wanting to get a college degree, they want to do vocational stuff, trade schools. You think about what NRCA has done with pro certification to try to create a professional track for somebody in the roofing industry. There are a lot of organizations like Women in Roofing and, young professionals and things like that, where we're trying to attract the new generation, trying to attract different segments of the workforce. I remember for those of you that went to have gone to Roofing Day in DC, one of the big things we always talk about is immigration. What can we do to help ease some of the immigration issues and get some workers into the workforce for purposes of helping supplement what we already have. So if you think about all those things that we've done, we're losing, hundreds and hundreds of workers a year to this drug. And that's why, even if you don't believe in trying to curtail it from an altruistic standpoint, you have to understand it from an economic standpoint. We have to do everything that we can to try to prevent these overdoses from people, getting hooked on this stuff from happening. Some other stats that are worth noting here, in Ohio, construction workers are 7 times more likely than other workers to have an opioid overdose. And then here's one: opioids were linked to 1 in 5 deaths, 20% of all deaths for adults age 25 to 34, which represents a large portion of the labor within construction industry. 1 in 5 deaths. Okay, think about that. I want to give you a real world story to kind of hit this point home. And I often debate, how personal I should get with seminars, but this is one that I think helps explain the importance of it. And I kind of went back and forth, but I think it's worth telling you. So here's the story. This was a while ago. This was probably 2008-9 or so. I have always, my family's always been in construction. I grew up in construction. I like hanging out with contractors, not lawyers. I tend to, many of them are my friends. And I had a very good friend of mine that was a commercial roofing contractor. Okay. Like many of you that might be on this call, his company was about $10 million a year. He did, light commercial, but also did some schoolwork. And like many of you that might be on this call, it was a generational roofing company. He was 3rd generation. And we just always got along. I met him through a local association 20 some odd years ago. And every month we would stay in touch. We went clay shooting a lot. I would text him and we'd go to lunch or dinner or whatever at least once a month. So we had that kind of relationship. It was a good friendship, and I would see him at industry events. We'd hang out, we'd talk. We always got along well. And I noticed that, it's probably, I guess I would say it was 2008, that the messages were kind of, not coming in as frequent as they used to. I wasn't getting the text messages anymore. And I'd call the office, and there was a woman in the office that handled everything, probably not too dissimilar for some of your companies. And I would call her and I'd say, hey, I'm just checking in on my friend, is he all right? Is everything good? He's like, oh yeah, he's just been busy. He's been dealing with stuff. And I'd call again and be like, yeah, he's been out of the office a lot. And, I later found out she was covering for him. So I would do the same. I would reach out to him and I'd call him and I'd say, hey man, we got to get together. Oh, I need to. I've just been busy. I can't do it, So finally I get this call from him. It's first quarter sometime 2009. And he calls me up and he says, Trent, I'd like to meet with you on these business issues. Can I come into your office? I'm like, sure, man. You don't have to ask me. Just come on down. So he comes down and he enters the conference room and I see him and I immediately know what's going on. I see the sluggishness. I see the pupils. I see the slurred speech, and he starts talking to me, and we have an hour conversation on legal issues. He had some succession planning stuff he was talking about. He had some collection matters, some contract work. There was a OSHA inspection that we talked about. We went through a variety of different issues that he had, and we got to the end of it. At one point, he put his head down on the table and said, "Oh man, I just got a headache. I got to rest," And I had sort of that moral dilemma where I didn't know if it was if I should butt in or if I shouldn't butt in. Should I say something to the guy or should I not? How do I deal with this? And I had a couple of minutes there where I wasn't really sure what my place was and whether or not I should say something. But ultimately, I turned to him and I just said, "Look, man, you're my friend. I'm taking my lawyer hat off, and I got to tell you, I'm real concerned about what I see here. I've been around the industry long enough to know that it looks like you got a problem, and I want to talk to you about it, and I want to anything I can do to help you, you let me know." And I wasn't sure how he was going to respond. I'll be honest with you, I was a little concerned there, but he turns to me and his eyes start welling up, and he starts crying a little bit, and he says, "Man, I'm in a bad place." And he's like, "I gotta be honest with you. My dad doesn't talk to me anymore." His dad was owner of the roofing company for a long time and was transitioning it to him. And he said, I went into the doctor. I had back pain, and the doctor prescribed, some Oxy, and I can't get off of it, man. I have tried. I've done everything I can. I can't get off the stuff, and I don't know what to do. It's ruining my life. My legs have swelled up. I don't know what to do." And I said, "Look, brother, what we need to do is, first thing I recommend is you talk to your father, because the father was well known in the industry, was well respected. And I know he was a good man." And I said, "We got to get you help. Okay, so I don't know whether or not your insurance company will cover this. I don't know to what extent you can get rehab or not, but I'll help you, man. Whatever you need, you got to get in rehab. You got to do it now, because I've seen this before. You're not looking good." And he says, "Okay, man, that's what I'm going to do." And that was, I remember pretty clear, it was a Thursday. And he walked out the door. I went about my merry way. And he had planned on talking to his father over the weekend. So I kind of was going to follow up with him on Monday and see what the status was. Okay, so I get in the office early Monday morning, and I get a phone call from the woman that's, that runs the office there. And I just figured it was him calling saying, "Hey, I talked to him, and he understood, and I'm taking some steps. I'm going to take some time off. I need you to help out with stuff," whatever. That wasn't the call that I got. The call that I got was from the woman who said, "Trent, I don't know how to tell you this, but your friend passed on Saturday from an overdose." And it was a combination of alcohol and opioids. And I got to tell you, I'll just be honest with you. You know, this again, I'm taking my legal hat off here. There's not a week that goes by now, even though it's been 10 years, that I don't think about that man and what else I could have done to help him, you know. And this was a very strong individual. This was not somebody that was weak. This is not somebody that went out and partied all the time. He was a good man, and these drugs ruined him. And the point of that story is I want to hit home to you that you have to be proactive. You've got to step up. You got to do something, because the stuff will grab you, and it is not that, you know, we're not talking about meth heads or coke heads or anything else. The stuff grabs you and you can't get off of it. It is so incredibly addictive, and quickly it becomes addictive within a matter of a week. So you know, hopefully you'll take that story home and remember, if it affected me personally, I guarantee it's affected some of you, and if it hasn't, it will. Let's talk about cost to employers. So one of the biggest things that I've seen opioids do is create a lot of problems for employers. Always a big proponent of safety. You know, I spent a lot of money internally on safety training for my people. I've got an OSHA 10, an OSHA 30, the HAZWOPER 24, whatever I can do in my spare time, I'll do it. And I'm sure you guys are the same way with your crew leaders, you know, project managers, whatever it might be. One of the things that I've seen a lot is all of you probably have great safety manuals, right? You probably have that nice 4-color safety manual, spiral bound, sitting on your shelf that you paid somebody to put together. And you probably do a decent job of toolbox talks and hitting the high points, how to put on a harness or proper use of a safety monitor or whatever it might be. Where I see a lot of roofing contractors fail is identification of the signs of impairment, okay? You want to go back to your safety manual and you want to take a look. You really want to take a hard look at your safety manual and kind of figure out, you know, what can I do there? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but when I talk about safety concerns, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, loss of employees and longer time off. Obviously, keeping employees, you know, producing is one of the biggest issues. You got to get more out of the employees that you got, because you can't find others to replace them. OSHA penalties for repeated injuries. I've seen an uptick in injuries that are caused by opioid use, and as a result, a lot of employers get tagged with OSHA related citations and fines as a result of those injuries. Obviously, locating and training new employees is something that it can be very costly and adversely impact a lot of roofing contractors. And then finally, employer liability for injuries and damages that employees that are hooked on opioids may cause. So these are some of the things I want to talk about, and I want to go into a little bit greater detail on some of these to give you guys some self-help. Let's talk a little bit. Let me back up a little bit. I want to talk, I guess, in a little bit more detail on some of these issues before we get to the injuries and the causes. On the safety concerns itself, on the signs of impairment, let me tell you what I mean by that. I have found in safety training that I've performed that the pictorial guides of signs of impairment is critical. So oftentimes different drugs have different signs of impairment. Many of you may live in recreational states. Okay, wherever I go, marijuana is the big topic. Okay, nobody's talking about opioids, everybody's talking about marijuana. My issue is that opioids is a much bigger threat. But in your safety manual, you want to have the signs of impairment of certain types of drug use. Okay, with opioids, obviously it's the pinpoint pupils, belabored breathing, slow response time. We'll get into some of the signs of overdose and how to deal with that. But it's useful to have pictorial guides because people learn in different ways. Okay, just because you have something written down in a safety manual doesn't mean that your crew are going to read it. As with everything, if you employ Spanish-speaking only crew, make sure that your employee manual and your safety manuals are in Spanish, and that they sign off on it so that they have an opportunity to learn the same thing that's in there. One of the things that, jumping around a little bit, the OSHA penalties. Let me give you some examples of some stuff that I've seen. I had a contractor call me. This was probably 4 or 5 years ago. Roofing contractor goes out to a job site, does new construction. Okay, for those of you that know, new construction margins are low. You have to really be, watching your P's and Q's on that one, because you can get burned pretty easy on new. So this contractor was out there doing work, a roofing contractor, and he had a gentleman that showed up to the job site before the foreman got out there, before the crew leader was out there. And he had been on opioids at the time, got up on the roof. He decided he was going to get up there, and I think he said he was up there to see if he left some of his gloves or whatever was up there. Gets up to the top of the roof, doesn't tie off, falls off, okay, gets himself injured. Ends up in the hospital, he's admitted. OSHA comes out, okay, and there were a lot of different issues that we had to navigate there. Okay, when somebody ends up in the hospital, a roofing contractor management needs to have an SOP, a standard operating procedure for dealing with injuries. And the reason why you need that is you don't want to be panicking at the time something happens. So oftentimes, if you have an employee that's injured, or an employee that, God forbid, that's a fatality, you have to have a plan in place so that the emotion is taken out of it, and you can focus primarily on making sure that you're doing what's best for your business. So keep in mind that when somebody is injured and they enter into the hospital, depending on your drug testing policy and what's done, oftentimes they're drug tested. That can affect a variety of things, including workers' compensation coverage. It can affect, to what extent those bad guy lawyers are out there. By bad guy lawyers, I mean the lawyers that you see late at night saying that, have you been in a car accident? It can also affect OSHA. So in this case, the gentleman was drug tested. The drug test happened to cover opioid-related drugs, which is a rarity, because a lot of times for drug-free workplaces, some of that stuff's not included. It was determined that the gentleman was impaired at the time, and that was useful for us in defending against the OSHA citation. Now, obviously, there are a variety of other issues that we had to deal with. One was, how was the guy able to get access to the roof, before the foreman got there? Okay, that was a lapse in their protocol, and that caused me some concern. So we set up some subsequent training. We tried to correct the situation. We did some additional retraining and toolbox talks on signs of impairment, and made sure that every employee understands, clock in, clock out type procedures. But it's so easy for these things to go unnoticed, and that's the issue. Let me turn to injuries and causes. And this is what I found real interesting in doing a lot of research on this. It's like I said before, it's the chronic pain from job site activities that cause a lot of people to turn towards opioid abuse. So think about operating a nail gun. Okay, my grandfather said in his time he didn't have a nail gun, and he was afraid of a nail gun when it sort of came to fruition. And he used to tell me, he said, I want to feel the hammer in my hand. I want to feel the hammer hit the nail, and I want to know exactly where that nail ended up, and I can't get that with a nail gun. Now, obviously, you got to use a nail gun now if you're going to keep production up. You don't have to, but most roofers do. When you're using a nail gun, that exposure to vibration over time has been proven to cause some musculoskeletal problems. Okay, it may not seem like it, but if you're doing that, 5, 6, 8 hours a day for 200 days out of the year, 300 days out of the year for 5 years, it's going to take a toll. Okay, that wear and tear, the wear and tear on your knees, the wear and tear on your back. I'm sitting in a chair right now. I got to tell you, my back's killing me, So it's that kind of stuff where they would go to a doctor, and that doctor readily prescribes the stuff because of some of the incentives and other things that you've heard. And then they can't properly function at the time. So one of the big things that I've seen from a safety perspective is a lot of safety professionals, including in-house and outside, focus on the big things like, how to properly tie off, how to, check for swing radius, and how to, do things that normally fall within the guidelines of roofing. But a lot of safety professionals skip over the basics. Okay, how to pick up a box, how to, focus on ergonomic practices that help reduce, wear and tear. And that's something that I think that you can take back to your office and really focus on, what can we do as a company to put a greater emphasis on eliminating that musculoskeletal type damage. And again, if nothing else, think of it this way. If you have one crew person that has to leave, or two crew people that have to leave because of this type of repetitive damage, and they're on opioids, or they have to take time off, that's a big hole in your production schedule. So I think it's worth being proactive and kind of figuring out ways to have toolbox talks on the basics. One of the things that has happened recently is an uptick in legislation. I always say the government is about 10 years behind where they need to be. This is probably a pretty good example of that. There's been a variety of acts that have been out there to help reduce or combat opioids. Unfortunately, most of them have only happened recently. The Budgeting for Opioid Addiction Treatment Act, this was introduced in the Senate in February of 2019. It imposes a 1-cent tax on sale of opioids with manufacturers, some distributors, and that's designed to go towards treatment. We have a lobbying company, and we supported Florida's House Bill 451, which required healthcare providers to provide better information to patients prior to doing that. The reason we supported it was for construction. There's some bills out there, Texas Senate Bill 315, which was interesting because it increased the ability of the medical board to basically find somebody guilty of malpractice for overprescribing opioids. And then there's a variety of states, Minnesota, Montana, and Wyoming are some of them that have limited initial use of opioids to what's called naive patients. Naive patients are those patients that have never been prescribed opioids before, to 7 days. Okay, some states, there's a pending bill in Florida now where they're trying to reduce that to 5. And the reason is that the studies show that after 7 days, there's a good chance that you're going to start developing some form of addiction. So the sooner that you can cycle off of that stuff, the better. And keep in mind, none of this existed before. None of this existed. So you had months and months and months of prescriptions going out when it didn't need to be. I would expect that in the current climate, you are going to continue to see additional both state and federal legislation that will come out to combat opioids. Okay, this is just the first volley and many that are to come. What's also interesting is the lawsuits, and that's probably something that you've seen on TV. Okay, the unions have stepped up. Okay, the Chicago Carpenters, Philadelphia Electrical Workers. There's several other unions out there that have sued the big pharmaceutical companies, and they did so because they uncovered a lot of the concerns that their members had, and it was primarily that they were being overprescribed. There was lack of information. There's lack of suitable treatment facilities. Just a variety of different issues that are out there. The big case that has gotten the most attention is the Oklahoma versus Purdue Pharma case. And it's not just Purdue Pharma that's in this case. Johnson & Johnson was in it. If you guys saw, there was a settlement that occurred. I think it was $572 million, or a verdict. It was $572 million. Purdue Pharma settled for $270. Okay. And this just shows you don't want to be a drug company in front of a jury on an opioid case. It's going to be a hard one for you to win. There are at least 35 state lawsuits right now, and at least one federal. I think as of yesterday, I saw a couple more lawsuits filed. This is tracking the same type of situation that I saw with tobacco. Okay, think about all the tobacco litigation that happened. For better or worse, everybody hates lawyers, right? I'm included, except for myself and the people that work for me. But the lawyers and the tobacco situation actually helped decrease smoking, actually put in some things in place to help reduce that. I am optimistic that a lot of these lawsuits will hurt some of these companies financially to the point where they have to be more responsible. What is interesting, and I've posed this question before, and this is just something for you to think about. Right now, everybody's talking about marijuana. Okay, I can't go outside the door without somebody telling me about the medical benefits of CBD oil. And I know there are medical benefits. I'm not saying there aren't. But I start hearing things like CBD oil can cure cancer, and CBD oil can do this, and marijuana can do that. And I can't help but wonder, I can't help but sit here and wonder if 5-10 years from now, we're going to be talking about the lawsuits against the marijuana and CBD oil, manufacturers and producers. The reason a lot of these lawsuits exist is they oversell. They oversell their capability. There's not enough warnings. There's not enough information. And what's going to happen is these plaintiff lawyers that are getting rich off these opioid cases now, they're going to go somewhere else. Okay, and where do you think they're going to go? So just something to think about. It's something that I kind of see will end up happening at some point. All right, let's talk about preventing opioid abuse. And this is some of the things that I want you guys to take back. Hopefully, even if you can just implement one of these things, I think it's going to be useful. Obviously, big believer in SOP, standard operating procedures. You should have an SOP for how to buy a pencil. And that sounds stupid, but trust me, it is. If you are interested in growing, if you have any turnover in your company, the more standard operating procedures that you have, it takes away uncertainty and it allows you to onboard quicker. Okay, it allows you to bring people into the mix quicker. Think about onboarding a new crew member. What do you do? Okay, what does your HR people do? What does your safety people do? What do your production team do? How do they do that? How can they be more efficient? Okay, if you're having to start from scratch and you don't really have protocols in place to deal with it, then that's the biggest thing that will slow down your efficiency. Safety manual updates. I already talked about signs of impairment. What a lot of contractors don't realize is your employee manual, your safety manual, and your contract is a living, breathing document. Okay, it is not something that you do once every 5 years. You should look at your safety manual every 6 months, honestly, because think about the amount of recent OSHA changes that have come down. The new silica standard. There was a new beryllium standard for metal cutting. The new crane standards. The increased inflation schedule. There have been some state statutes on hydration. All of these things need to be taken into account and updated in your safety manual. Marijuana, great example. For those of you that are in states that if we have anybody from Vermont on the line or any other states that have gone 100% recreational, big change, and you need to definitely update your drug-free workplace policy, update your safety manual, and have some toolbox talks on signs of impairment and let people understand what they can do and what they cannot do. Toolbox talks, I think, are an incredibly useful way to convey a culture of safety. Okay, whenever we are doing OSHA defense for a roofing contractor across the U.S., one of the things that I hear from the co-shows and the assistant area directors are, it's great that you've got this safety manual, it's great all this, but show me your culture of safety. Show me that it is going from management, the people on this call, down to the person on the roof, okay? And that's the key, is the toolbox talks help do that. And having a toolbox talk in and of itself is not going to necessarily solve the problem, okay? It has to be a systemic approach to safety. But please make sure that if you have a toolbox talk, that you've got sign-off sheets for all of your employees, and those are in the file, okay? Anytime that you're dealing with any kind of safety concerns, you want to be able to put your hands on that documentation as quickly as possible, okay? And that's for any kind of government regulation. Think about that from I-9s and ICE, okay? Immigration, you want to have all your I-9s in a separate folder, okay? And that way you can put your hands on it quickly. All that kind of stuff helps in the event that there is a government inspection or something that you have to deal with, because again, it takes away anxiety. It helps eliminate one of many problems. Third-party consultants are very useful. I've found a lot of times that I can sit here, we've got 85 employees throughout the company, and I can sit and I can beat my chest and I can tell people what to do and how to do it, but they don't listen to me a lot. So it's good to have somebody come in outside, an independent consultant, to say, here's what's happened. Okay, one of the most impactful things that I've seen done is have a former crew member or a former employee or a current crew member that suffered from opioids talk to the crew. Okay, it's one thing to have a guy with some initials after his name, PhD, whatever. It's another thing to have somebody that's actually been in roofing sit down and talk to your crew people about the problems with opioids, so that if they have pain, they're not self-medicating, they're not trying to cover up potential problems with these drugs, and they understand that how it's going to impact them. The key thing that as an employer you want to hit home is exploring alternative options for treating injuries. Now keep in mind, every employer in the US is governed by HIPAA laws, okay? So you can't get too much into why somebody is taking drugs, but you can certainly educate people on the problem, and you can certainly suggest that there are alternative options for treating. Okay, I mentioned before that most injuries, roofing related injuries, the overwhelming number of injuries are soft tissue. And generally the over-the-counter stuff works pretty good to deal with it. Okay, Advil, Aleve, Tylenol, it will help. Okay, it's not as powerful, but it will do the job. So it's important that if you've got a toolbox talk or if you've got somebody speaking in, let them know, you know, it's not worth, they may be the sole breadwinner for a large family. And if they are taken out because they have taken a substance, then they're not going to be able to support their family. They need to understand that, okay? Last point here is employers and HR professionals, they've got to work hand in hand with healthcare providers. Okay, the healthcare providers historically have been the problem, but there's a lot of healthcare providers that are now taking a different approach. So while you can't tell an employer not to take opioids, okay, you can obviously prevent them from performing their job if they're unable to perform their job, but you can't say, hey man, you are not allowed to take a prescribed opioid out of work, okay? That becomes a little bit more difficult. What you can do is you can say, you know, here are some options for you, and you can work with healthcare providers that you know employ doctors and service providers that are not going to overly prescribe opioid pain management. Now, how does that work? Prescription benefit managers, PBMs. We just got through with our healthcare renewal, and it was awful. But prescription benefit managers, what they do is they help you as the employer evaluate the potential versus the actual opioid prescriptions. So doctors that overprescribe opioids are red flagged. Okay, you can look at certain doctors, certain service providers, and have a better understanding of who is doing the right thing and who is doing the wrong thing. Okay, and one of the biggest things that I've seen help crew and help you attract talent is employee assistance programs. Okay, many of you may have EAPs, but here's a stat that I think will be astonishing. Okay, I read in preparing for the seminar that employee assistance programs, for every dollar you spend, you get $1.25 back. Okay, think about that. I wish I had that kind of return in the stock market, right? So the reason is that a lot of people are attracted to employers that offer employee assistance programs. Why? Okay, because if you are addicted to a substance, it's embarrassing. Okay, if you need help, it's embarrassing and it's expensive. Treatment is incredibly expensive. So if you have the opportunity to use an employee assistance program that's offered by your employer confidentially, then that is a good reason to go work there. Okay, another interesting statistic, the majority use of an EAP is not for drug abuse, it's for mental health disorders, okay, mental health issues. And there's a lot of crew that are actively seeking out roofing contractors that have EAPs so they can get help with their depression or their OCD or their anxiety or whatever the issues might be confidentially, because they can't otherwise afford the treatment. Okay, think about that. Think about that from a hiring perspective. If you have an EAP, it's important that you educate your people on it. Okay, have a toolbox talk, have a training session on it, promote it through the drug-free workplace. It's a great benefit. It's something that I think you will see more and more people in our industry using. Obviously it is confidential, so the goal is to provide the information and then let the employee access it as it sees necessary. Here's a sample of a standard drug-free workplace policy that focuses more on prescription drugs. Okay, most drug-free work policies that I see, they focus on the illegal stuff. Okay, what's interesting about opioids is that it is prescribed. It is prescribed a lot of times, so it's difficult. It's difficult to tell whether or not people are on it. And you want to have a very specific safety manual, employee manual policy, drug-free workplace policy dealing with prescription drugs, okay? I've always been a big believer that when you're hiring someone, your job description helps put that individual in a box, okay? So let's say you're hiring a crew person, and let's say you do, you know, commercial work, okay? In your hiring paperwork, you need to say, look, I need you to be able to do the following, okay? Operate a lift, be able to lift materials that weigh in excess of 40 pounds, you know, go through every single part of that job, okay? And then if you can't ask somebody necessarily what they are on and what is their problem, you know, why are you hurt? You can't really say that from a HIPAA standpoint. What you can say is you can say, here is your job description. Is anything that you are taking now going to prevent you from performing these job functions? And that's the key, is spend a little bit more time on job descriptions for your employees, because what it will do is it will allow you to navigate the federal laws a little bit better and help ensure that you've got somebody that's safe working up on the roof. Workplace culture is one of the big things that I think you need to focus on. And for the longest time, there's been this sort of, everybody looks down on anybody that's got an addiction issue. And I understand it. Look, I got it. But I also understand, I gave you my own personal example of how easy it is to get addicted on something like this. And it's not necessarily that person's fault. So the idea is to promote a culture of health and wellness. And I'm not talking about safe spaces and, you know, that kind of stuff, you know, snowflake type mentality. I'm not talking about that. But what I am talking about is you want to encourage people to take care of themselves, okay? If you've got office staff, think about what you can do to, you know, help ergonomics. You know, we switched to some stand-up desk and people loved it. Do I think it's that great? No. But from a hiring perspective, they like the fact that I had that stuff. So great, they got it, okay? Support recovery in the workplace. Definitely, if they see you as a member of management making fun of people that have drug problems and they have a drug problem, do you think they're gonna come to you, okay? Do you think that they will feel comfortable telling you or engaging in the EAP or other things if you have sort of a negative, overly negative statements that are made out in public? Also connect with the community. You know, outreach is important, because a lot of times I mentioned the example of bringing in former crew to talk about opioid problems. It just has a huge impact. And again, they don't want to hear from people with suits on. They want to hear from one of their own. Overdoses in the workplace. This is something that you need to understand. And I gave you some of the examples of problems that or signs that somebody is on opioids at the time. Obviously, pinpoint pupils, we discussed that. Falling asleep and loss of consciousness. Okay, that is one of the scariest signs. Slow, shallow breathing, choking or gurgling sounds, limp body, and pale blue or cold skin. Okay, told you I was going to give you some real world examples. I have been called on at least 2 occasions by an owner of a roofing contractor, 2 different roofing contractors, thank God, where one of their employees was overdosing. And the first thing out of my mouth is, why are you calling me? Call 911. You know, don't call me, call 911. You know, you have to measure legal liability with being a human. And that's the first thing that you want to do, is you want to try to take care of that person. Obviously, call 911 immediately. It's a good idea to have Narcan on hand. Narcan is a nasal spray. The actual name is naloxone. And you inhale that stuff, and what it does is the substance within opioids that blocks the receptors for breathing, it clears that up. so it could save somebody's life. If you have that on hand, that's great. Now, I get asked the question, Trent, if I think somebody's overdosing and I give them this stuff, they're just going to sue me for administering this stuff and say I assaulted them. Well, how you deal with that is you address it in your employee manual and you say, you know, in our discretion, if we believe you've overdosed on opioids, we will administer Narcan. You agree to waive any liability associated with us providing you with this substance, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and again, if it's a choice of letting someone die or getting sued, potentially getting sued, I would, you know, I'm not going to let someone die on my watch. Try to keep the person awake and breathing. If they fall asleep, it's bad. Okay, it's really, really bad. It's hard to get people up after they have fallen asleep. You want to lay the person on their side, because what will happen is they'll start choking. They're not able to breathe correctly, swallow correctly. If you lay them on the side, it helps with that. And please, like I said, be a human. Stay with them until emergency workers arrive. One of the guys that had called me in that example before, the reason he called me is he wanted to get out of there. He's like, look, man, I don't know if this guy's legal. I got to get out of here. Well, you know, like, no. You need to stay there. You're a human. Don't leave the scene. That's bad. Stay there and deal with them. So how are employers and U.S. healthcare providers curtailing opioid abuse today? Well, it's interesting because Cigna, and there's several other insurance carriers that are out there, they have taken a very proactive approach in targeting communities, especially those that are high in opioid abuse. And they're working together with doctors and prescribers to reduce a lot of the problems that are out there. Employers within the construction industry are also engaging in some drug education and counseling programs. We talked about creating an environment where there's less of a likelihood that you're going to have people that are scared to disclose or get help. Revisit your zero tolerance policies. It's very difficult. We live in a world now, especially with recreational marijuana, where zero tolerance drug policies are very difficult to enforce. Think about having things like what's known as a second chance agreement or a last chance agreement, which gives someone the opportunity to sign a document saying that, okay, you got me this time. If you get me again, I'm gone. Okay. Think about exempting things like marijuana from your zero tolerance policy. All those things can be useful for employee retention. And then clearly train your supervisors or your foremen to spot the signs of opioid abuse. Last slide here. I want to talk a little bit more about what the unions have done. The unions have taken a very proactive approach in vetting rehab centers. And that's the key, is a lot of these rehab centers are fake. Okay, they just take people's money and they're not really doing what they're supposed to be doing. It was interesting, Reed Ribble, the CEO of NRCA, back when he was a congressman, he actually wrote to Department of Health requesting that they take a closer look at funding for these types of things. The other thing is looking at income and capability to afford rehab and providing some sort of offset for that. You know, the one thing that I think that if we think about it, if we talk about it, if we educate on it, then I think we as an industry are going to be able to help prevent some of these tragic deaths from happening. Again, I don't want to leave it to the government or lawyers to curtail this. I want to stop it now, you know, because I can't live in a place where somebody like my friend died. I just don't want to do that again. So I am at the 2 o'clock mark, so I'm going to stop here and see if you guys have any questions for me.
I'm going to take everybody off mute so that anybody can just ask a question if you have any questions. So if anyone has a question, just speak up.
Well, I want to thank you guys. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And again, if you have any questions offline, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to address any suggestions or comments you have. I work closely with a lot of HR professionals and other people trying to figure out ways collectively that we can help do this. And, you know, we've also been very active in some legislation recently, which I think is going to be useful for, you know, hopefully putting a nail on this one. So.
Thank you very much, Trent. And if anyone does have any questions, you can email me and I can forward them to Trent. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. All right, bye-bye.